Hello everyone, welcome to the next episode in the Olden Word series of book reviews. First review for 2022. Back in the original setup. It's better natural lighting, you can just record when I want. Uh, first review for 2022, Smith of Wootton Major. Now this is my 11th Tolkien work, I believe, or perhaps it may be even my 13th individual work, because I read Tree and Leaf, which is composed of three things, two of which I can remember, which is Leaf by Niggle and Mythopoeia, the poem. So I believe I might have read 13 individual works from Tolkien, so I'm quite happy with that. So Smith of Wootton Major was Tolkien's last work to be published in his lifetime. It's a children's story, but it's very much adult and in its sensibility. It's very melancholy as well. Um, Originally, I thought it was going to be about. I somewhat knew about Smith of Wootton Major. I'll probably just call it Smith from now on. I originally thought that Smith was going to be a story about subcreation, but it's more a story about bereavement and generations and passing of time and the power of Faery and the fading power of Faery. If you've read Tolkien's other works, this feels very much like an ending. I believe even Tolkien himself called it an old man's story. It's very much about how he's close to his own death, and he's aware of the sort of fading power of the imagination, or weakening even. It's very much reminiscent of that going to the west and the fading of the elves and all that sort of stuff, in a sort of grand scheme of things. Essentially, before I get into this I should say this is a 2015 extended edition, hardcover. Before I get into the main story, I just want to clarify a few things about what I felt about this edition in and of itself. So the actual story is only 54 pages long, but in line with the recent publications in the sort of Tolkien estate, that whole sort of oeuvre, you get a lot of extras in these sorts of books with Tolkien nowadays. The actual story isn't the main thing. You'll get a lot of analyses and notes and appendices. That's kind of standard for Tolkien, but especially nowadays with things like Fall of Gondolin and Tale of Beren and Luthien and whatnot. It's very much, the story is almost secondary, but the actual Tolkien's process and the notes and the transcriptions and facsimiles and whatever it might be, that's kind of the main thing that you buy this for. And I did want to know more about the story. I didn't want to just get a 54-page story and that's that. I wanted to read, for example, about to read the major essay by Tolkien himself. I wanted to read the genesis of the story. I wanted to read for example, there's also the time scheme of the story and the various characters, and also the relation to the Golden Key, which is a story by George MacDonald, and I've reviewed George MacDonald and the Golden Key actually on this channel, and how that relates to Smith. Because this book was originally was supposed to be, its inception was essentially a preface. Tolkien was writing a preface, or asked to write a preface about the Golden Key, and then he eventually realised that he didn't want to do that, and came up with his writing of the preface spawned Smith. And I'll say, just before I get into the story, I'm not entirely sure that these extras improved the overall impression of the book. I'll get onto that, why that is later on, but I felt like it was sort of just detail for detail's sake. Apologies for the noise there. Detail for detail's sake, and it didn't quite improve the picture of my impression of the story. A lot of superfluous detail, just kind of, the story could have been nice and simple and homely and have a nice message, but then it seemed to just be Tolkien almost just, what's the word? He just seems to be wading through lineages, and as he does, if you know Tolkien, he's very much based. He loves family trees. He loves etymology. He loves exploring characters for the generations, all that sort of stuff. That sort of grand scheme of things, the overall sort of world picture. And I felt like that was completely unnecessary for this story. But we'll get into that. Smith of Wootton Major. It's about what seems a short and very what should be a simple story turns out to be quite a broad story, broad adventure. It's about a village called Wootton Major, uh, and they have this festival every 24 years. It's called the Feast of Good Children, I believe it is. There's actually two names for it. I think it's called the Feast of Good Children. Um, and essentially, 24 good children are selected in winter to come around this table and partake in this great feast. And the central part of that great feast is this great cake, um, which is. So the idea for this great cake in the centre of this feast, and all of these children are going to eat and and that is a basis for the community. Um, Really, it comes down to an almost allegorical statement, although Tolkien, obviously, he protested against allegory quite a lot, actually. Um, it does feel allegorical, though. So this great cake, you have this idea where uncritical and unthinking critics of fantasy and of Faery, who don't know the true power of Faery, perhaps, they don't know why mythology and fantasy and imagination is key to the human experience. And they'll say, "Oh, it's just childish escapism. It's just fantasy. It's make believe. It's for children. It's purely in the domain of the child." Um, Tolkien is suggesting with this that the great cake is their perception, is the critic of it's their perception of fantasy. It's a sweet saccharine thing. Whereas Tolkien, he has I would say a better understanding of fantasy and its meaning and power and sort of use. And so there's this object, the Fae Star. I won't try and say I won't say as much more than this, but there's this Fae Star, this object, and if you're familiar with Tolkien, he's a fan of artifacts, rings and gems and whatnot. There's this Fae Star, this thing that comes of Faery, of the fantastical realm, this nebulous space outside the human realm. This comes to be within the cake itself, and you can see there that there is this saccharine surface level, sweet tasting thing. But if you ingest the Fae Star, for example, that then is subsumed within you, and then that is the true power of Faery, and then that will go on to mold you and shape you. I'll leave it at that. So I really love that I love that concept of the saccharine, and the surface level and the sweet and the superficial, but really what you are ingesting is something much greater than that. So it's like, for example, if you read The Hobbit, you've read a children's story, but then over time it might come to influence you, and you'll see the greater meaning behind it, perhaps. And you can say that with any sort of story, really, but I guess it's more specific to fantasy, because on the surface sometimes it can look kind of just like escapism. And I'm very much interested in Tolkien's idea of escape. I actually just written a story called The Escapist, which is all about. It's this idea that Tolkien wrote. You can find it online. He says, why should a prisoner, something to the effect of, why should a prisoner essentially feel bad about wanting to talk about other things in prison cells and prison life and whatnot. And he's saying that escape isn't something. It's not the flight of a deserter. It's it's someone that's looking outward to what they ought to want, and to what and to use the power of the imagination to sort of escape. That's really what that comes down to. Now, I'll just say that the story concerns a man called Smith, or he begins as a young boy, and he grows up with this influence of the Fae Star, and it's very much. This reminded me of a Dunsany in miniature. It reminded me of the King of Elfland's Daughter in miniature. It's very much about exploring Faery. It's got this timeless, ethereal quality to it, and it really didn't. Now that I think about it and reflect on it, it's very much like Dunsany's King of Elfland's Daughter. So if you're a fan of that book, I would give this a try. So there really is a lot to say here for a story that is 54 pages long, or thereabouts. there's a lot of community aspects and familial aspects and sort of generational aspects as well. It's kind of a lot to get into actually. It's quite impressive how much there is. So this community is based around this concept of the master cook, and the title of the master cook is handed down through generations. There's a man called Noakes who he's very much against. He sniggers and laughs and mocks the concept of Faery. But there's his assistant called Alf. You might see where that's going there, Alf. If you're familiar with the terminology there, the etymology there. Who is Noakes' assistant, and he's very much on our side. If you're a fan of fantasy, Alf is on our side, and Noakes is the pragmatic, sort of sterile, and the humourless, and the just that side that somewhat denigrates fantasy, and it doesn't have much imagination. Doesn't like thinking outside the box and all that sort of stuff. You could come up with various adjectives and ways to describe it. So you have these two that play off each other, and then Smith comes into the story later on after the events after this great cake is made, and there's this whole community dynamic in this story which I found fascinating, and it almost reminded me of the Hobbits. They have their own sort of family names and histories, and there's a lot to do about crafts and reputation and all sorts of stuff in this book. And so I don't want to, because it's such a short story, I don't want to go into too much more detail than that. I think I'll spend the rest of before I get into the excerpts, I want to just talk about these extras. I felt that they were somewhat unnecessary. So for example, there's a whole time scheme where Tolkien, I feel like Tolkien wanted to write a bigger story but didn't have the energy because he's an old man now, in the 60s, in the late 60s. He wanted to write a bigger story. He was very much still influenced by the Silmarillion and influenced by Lord of the Rings and his greater mythology, I think, because he spends an inordinate amount of time for such a short story talking about things that don't happen in the story itself, the story that you read. So we'll get this time scheme which is included in this edition. So we'll get all these different characters. It might actually be reversed there, but so Alf, we'll get Ella, who is barely mentioned in the story, but then it's like a timeline. So we'll get all this cast of characters, some of which don't even appear in the story itself, but then we'll get a timeline with dates starting from the year 1000. So grandfather born 1000, 1018, grandfather goes off on his travels and only returns at irregular intervals to Wootton Major until 1035. It sounds very much like Bilbo actually. Noakes born 1030. Grandfather becomes a master cook 1044, and then in 1048 grandfather manages a 24 feast. That's just the feast of the good children, with notable success. 1062, at 25, Ella marries Oldsmith, who is 10 years older. I mean, I felt like this was just I'm not entirely sure why it was necessary. It felt like it was removing the magic out of such a simple story. I don't know why I had to overanalyze it like this. Various things about who succeeds who to take the title of the Master Cook, where the Faestar ends up. It's almost like the Silmarillion in miniature with regards to the Silmarils and how they, their eventual fate. And then there's suggestions for the end of the story where Tolkien goes through the entirety of the story and dwells on all manner of things, and talks about the customs, and I feel like Tolkien obviously is a world builder. If there's anyone that's a world builder, it's Tolkien, but I felt like he was ruining the simplistic magic of the story by going into all this detail and delineating between titles and family names and whatnot. It just felt like just felt like it was unneeded and unnecessary. So I did read this, but honestly, it kind of got a little bit grating at the end because he goes he goes into a little bit too much detail, and also what I wanted to say there was that this book itself, each section is different, but it does seem to cover the same sort of things, but just in different words, essentially. Um, the essay though does have some good stuff on it, on the power of fairy and the what Tolkien means when he says it's not an allegory, and he talks about the nature of fairy and the vagueness and the ambiguity of it, and it's very much like on fairy stories if you've read that. Um, then he goes on to talk about this, for example, the situation in the village of Wootton is evidently of this sort. It was governed for local purposes by a council, probably a group of the heads of the chief and most prosperous crafts. The crafts were still traditional and largely heritable, handed down from father to son. They were in the proper surnames. The names Smith, Cooper, Miller, Wright, Weaver, Webster, Stonewright, and the like indicate that their bearers actually practiced that craft. He talks about, uh, even makes up, this isn't even in the story, so cooking was an exception. Though recognised and esteemed skill, it was not practised as a family craft, nor generally as a livelihood. There was nothing corresponding to eating houses. Strangers on business could get food and lodging at the one inn. It was called by no other name at this time, though over the door could still be seen a carved stone, much defaced by time, bearing apparently a representation of 3 trees and the inscription, and then it gives an Old English inscription there. Just a lot of detail, and it just goes on and on for no apparent reason. I believe he even talks about distance between villages at one point. I'm not entirely sure. I have a lot of, if I've read 13 individual works for Tolkien, I have a lot of patience for Tolkien, but it's just, I thought that was not necessary at all. Apologies for the dog there. Anyway, I didn't really get much out of the extras, let's put it that way. And I usually finish books completely. I try to finish all sections, but I skipped the hybrid draft and transcription of The Great Cake, which is what the story used to be called in its early conception. I just skipped that completely because I just got a little bit tired of the story, and I didn't want to read an earlier and perhaps lesser version of the story, so I just skipped that. I skipped the notes as well about various things about etymology and whatnot. However, I realised that going on that little bit of a ramble there might have given you the impression that I did not enjoy the story. That's not true. The actual concept of the story and the aesthetic and the homeliness and the coziness of it, the meaning of it is brilliant. And that's why I recommend the story. It's just I'm not entirely sure that you necessarily need to read all the extras. So, some excerpts just to give you an idea what this book sounds like. He took it down and blew the dust off the lid, but when he opened it, he found that very little of the spices was left, and they were dry and musty. But in one compartment in the corner, he discovered a small star, hardly as big as one of her sixpences, black-looking, as if it was made of silver but was tarnished. "That's funny," he said, as he held it up to the light. "No, it isn't," said a voice behind him, so suddenly that he jumped. It was the voice of Prentice. Prentice, short for apprentice, that's Alf, the character of Alf. And he had never spoken to the master in that tone before. Indeed, he seldom spoke to Noakes at all unless he was spoken to first. Very right and proper in a youngster. He might be clever with icing, but he'd a lot to learn yet. That was Noakes' opinion. "What do you mean, young fellow?" he said, not much pleased. "If it isn't funny, what is it?" "It is Fae," said Prentice. "It comes from Faery." Then the cook laughed. All right, he said. "It means much the same, but call it that if you like. You'll grow up some day. Now you can get on with stoning the raisins. If you notice any funny fairy ones, tell me." What are you going to do with the star, master?" said Prentice. "Put it into the cake, of course," said the cook. "Just the thing, especially if it's fairy." He sniggered. "I dare say you've been to children's parties yourself, and not so long ago either. where little trinkets like this were stirred into the mixture and little coins and whatnot. Anyway, we do that in this village, it amuses the children. But this isn't a trinket, master, it's a Fae star, said Prentice. So you've said already, snapped the cook. Very well, I'll tell the children. It'll make them laugh. This one is very reminiscent of Dunsany and sort of ethereal. When I imagine Dunsany, I think of golden light and time and ethereal space and sort of natural beauty, sort of timelessness in a way. The feast had been in midwinter, but it was now June, and the night was hardly dark at all. The boy got up before dawn, for he did not wish to sleep. It was his 10th birthday. He looked out of the window and the world seemed quiet and expectant. A little breeze, cool and fragrant, stirred the waking trees. Then the dawn came, and far away he heard the dawn song of the birds beginning, growing as it came towards him, until it rushed over him, filling all the land round the house, and passed on like a wave of music into the west, as the sun rose above the rim of the world. It reminds me of Faery, he heard himself say, but in Faery the people sing too. Then he began to sing, high and clear, and strange words that he seemed to know by heart, and in that moment the star fell out of his mouth, and he caught it in his open hand. So I'll leave it there. Definitely worth your time reading. I just think that the extras were perhaps a little bit too much, I think. There's a lot in here that I've not covered, and a lot of good imagery as well. It's very, it feels like Tolkien, an encapsulation of what Tolkien stands for and what he was writing and what his sort of purpose was. So that was Smith of Wootton Major. Thanks for watching, everyone. Until next time.